Today I'm going to show you how to fix a 59.FO error. This is a HP M651 printer, but this is also applicable to the 3525, the 4025, 4525, and the M551 printer. If you look in the manual, the first step it tells you to do is check the alienation sensor. You can skip that. That will never be the issue. It also tells you to replace the transfer belt, which sometimes that will make the issue go away. It does not fix it. It masks the issue. And once we get this apart, I'll show you why. And the last thing that a lot of places that sell parts will tell you is that you need to replace the fuser drive assembly. Now that will fix it, but you do not need to replace the fuser drive assembly. And again, once I take this apart, I'll show you exactly why replacing the fuser drive assembly does fix it, but I'll also show you how to fix it without replacing that, because they cost about $70 to $90 typically. So let's get to taking this machine apart. For the most part, all you need is a flathead and a Phillips head screwdriver. We're going to start with removing the formatter, and then we'll take out all the screws on this side. That one, that screw, that one, and this one. So take care to notice the screws on this door are slightly bigger than the screws in the rest of the machine. So to get this piece, there's release tabs right up here. If you look close, you can see the arrow, and this arrow points right to them. Put your screwdriver in and just push down like that, and it comes right off. And then there's another screw for the top cover right there. Also, two additional screws for this cover that were there. So this whole cover slides this way to remove it, but it's also hooked into the back cover. Right there you have another arrow there. It's hooked into those spots on the back cover. Now to get the top cover off, first you have to take this piece off, and you just pry right here and it'll pop up. Excuse me, right here, and it'll pop up. And then there's the second one right about here. And this whole cover comes off, and there's another screw hidden down right there. back cover. Screw there. I think that's it for the back. The other models may have more screws on the back than this one. The way the models come apart is slightly different for the top cover and the side cover, but for the most part it's extremely similar. Now with that off, there's your release tab arrow there, 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 and then one over here. So the whole back cover should come off. Now to get to wires, to get to the fuser drive assembly, we'll also want to take this top cover off. Basically just lift up on the back and then pull it towards you. These slide into the top, and that's basically what holds that side of it down. Now for this part of the top cover, there's a screw right down in there. And we will want to get this part of the cover off. It'll help us get to the wiring. Way off. Typically what I'll do is get it like that just so you can get to these wires. Stick something right in here to keep it up. Just wedge something in there to keep it standing up so you can get to the wires. Alright, we need to take this formatter cage off. And we'll need to remove the DC controller. So we'll start with this screw, this one up here, and then there's one in through this hole here. If you look from this side, you can see it right up there. And also one on the back that somebody did not put back in this one. There. So we'll take those out. Now we also want to remove this little cover here. We're not going to remove the low voltage power supply, but this will give us access to screws that are holding the formatter shield on. This whole thing just slides to the left and then comes off. So this screw and this screw also need to come out. And you also want to disconnect the interconnect board. This little ribbon cable here. This plug right here. This plug I usually leave connected along with the USB and just tuck this out of the way up here. And that gives you access to this screw and the screw up here to get this whole formatter pan to come out. Oh, I missed one screw. Through this hole, you can see it through the back. That screw right there. I missed another one? Yep, forgot that one. Definitely helps to take all the screws out that need to come out. So next step is we want to get this DC controller out. So we want to take this panel off. It's just a little release tab on it. These two screws hold the DC controller, so we'll go ahead and take those out. So this side piece just slides straight up. You want to pull out on the top a little bit and then lift it straight up. You can see this little hook slides into that hole right there. So when you're putting it back in, you want to line that hook up with that and then push it down. And that'll lock it into place. So as you can see, if you're not familiar with doing this repair, it's a good idea to lay the parts out in the exact order that you took them off. That way when you put it back together, you don't skip something and then have to take it back apart to put other stuff back in that you forgot. So now we will do the DC controller. We'll just remove all of these plugs. Just be careful. Some of them have release tabs. Like this one where you have to push up on it to release it. Most of them just pull right out, but there's a few of them. Just keep your eye out. I just want to release these two from the low voltage power supply, and those we're going to unroute all the way up to the top just to give us access space to work. It's also a good idea to take a picture of the DC controller before you start taking stuff out of it. There's some open plugs where just nothing goes to, and if you haven't done one of these a handful of times, you might not remember which plugs were open. You might think you tucked a wire behind something and forgot to plug it back in. So it's always a good idea to take a picture, make sure you know which plugs are open, which ones have plugs in them. It'll save you a lot of time in the long run. The way the DC controller comes out is you lift up on it. There's two little hooks on this side that go into the metal. Can't really see them, but it's also this little plastic piece there that goes through the metal housing of the DC controller shield. But you just lift it up, slide it to the right. Just get all the wires out of the way and unhooked off of it, which is much easier with two hands than one. And also make sure you don't forget the plug like I did, or two plugs. Then the whole thing comes out with the shield on the back. And that gives us access to the upper high voltage power supply, which we need to remove to gain access to our fuser drive assembly. So to remove the upper high voltage power supply, there is 3 screws. One down there and one at the top left corner. You want to have a magnetized tip on your screwdriver so that you don't drop the screw down into the low voltage power supply. Also, these 3 screws are 3 of the few that have washers on them. So just make sure you pay attention to put the correct screw back into it. Once those 3 screws are out, the other thing that holds the upper high voltage power supply are little release tabs. So there's that one, and this one over on the left. These 2 at the top, you just push in and you see the board pop out when you push in. This one pushes to the right. This one here, you push to the right also. And the whole board comes out, and you have to remove that plug right there, and the whole board comes out. There is our fuser drive assembly. Now we're not going to remove the actual fuser drive assembly, we just want to take that solenoid right there out of the machine. So to do that, we need to free up this wire harness, pull this out of the way, and then this little black piece we need to remove. And then there'll be 2 screws, take those out, and then the solenoid will pop right out. So we'll start with the wiring. This plug to make it easier, give it a little more slack. And we also want to pull out this plug for the solenoid. Now to get this little black piece out, there's a release tab right there. You want to lift that up and slide the entire black piece to the right. And then it lifts straight out. And there are your 2 screws to get to the solenoid on the fuser drive assembly. That is what we want to take out. So once those screws are out, it's a little difficult with just one hand, but basically you pull it back towards you, wiggle it till the whole thing comes out. And then you have access to the solenoid. Now it's hard to take it all the way out because this plug blocks it from going through there. So usually what I do is I repair this while it's in there. So the reason these fail intermittently at first is this solenoid has already been repaired. As you can see, it's got electrical tape on it. But from the factory, they come with a foam pad right there. That's to dampen the noise it makes when the solenoid is activated. What happens over time is the felt breaks down, and instead of being a little soft pad, it turns into a sticky, ooey little piece of glue. So when the solenoid activates, it sticks just like that. And then this little hook doesn't catch the gear on the next rotation, and it throws the air because it's expecting this to catch the gear and not let it drive it. That's why it starts intermittently at first. And if you go out with, say, a transfer belt and put the transfer belt in, turn the machine off, turn it back on, it'll work and you'll think you fixed it. But you didn't. You could have just turned the machine off, turned it back on, and it probably would have worked just the same way as if you hadn't put that transfer belt in. So you can always test the solenoid just by pressing down on it. It should immediately pop back up just like that. No matter how hard you press on it, it should pop right back up. So the way you fix these is, back off for a better view, but take this little arm off. Be careful with the spring so you don't lose the spring. So you have the arm, and you want to clean this area of the arm really good. Use alcohol, make sure there's no residue from the felt pad left on it. And then on the solenoid itself, do the same thing right here, and you can cover it with electrical tape, invisible tape, whatever kind of tape you have. And in theory, that tape should never break down, so you should never have to do this repair on the same machine a second time. This should last forever. I've got several of these models that have well over 1 million pages. We've had to do this one time only. Never replace the diffuser drive assembly. So the most important step when you're putting it back together is when you put this back through that hole, this little hook is not going to go into the right place. It's supposed to ride against the gear in there, but because we're putting it in, it's actually going to push against the gear. So after we put it in, there's one very important step, which people who've tried this fix and have still ended up with the 59 error, this is the reason why that happens. So once I get it in there, I will show you, and I'll try to explain it in a way that makes sense so that you understand why that happens. Alright, so what happens when you put that back in, imagine my finger is the arm on the solenoid. Imagine this is the gear. So when you put it in, it pushes up against the gear. So it's not actually on the gear where it's supposed to be. Actually, it'd be better like this. It's pushing like that. So what you need to do is push on the arm of the solenoid while it's already screwed in, and it will pop. And now it'll be on the side of the gear where it's supposed to be. So as the gear rotates, there's a little notch that sticks up, and when that notch gets to the solenoid, it hooks it and it keeps the gear from spinning. Now, if it's stuck to the side of it, it just keeps spinning and spinning and spinning. So very important, once it's in, and I'll show you how to do this. Won't be able to see it very well, but basically you take a pick hook from the top. Where'd I put mine? There it is. So from that little hole, you want like an angled pick, sort of like this. And you just push it down in there. And you hear that pop. Basically, I was pushing on the arm of the solenoid. So whenever I pushed on it, that little hook was able to pop in. And now it's on the right side of the gear. It's not just pushing on it. If you don't do that step, when you put this whole thing back together, it is just going to throw that error again because the solenoid is pushing against the gear, not riding on the outside of it like it's supposed to be. So at this point, all you do is reassemble it the exact opposite order that we took it apart, which would start with this, and then putting the wiring back. Then the upper high voltage power supply, DC controller, plug all the plugs back in. HPs are nice. All the plugs are different size, so it's basically impossible to plug the wrong wire into the wrong plug. And then you just put each of these pieces back on one by one. Very important, one step I almost always forget to do is, well, it's over here, but when you plug the interconnect board back in, make sure that the ribbon cable goes in nice and tight. If you power it up and you get a backlit LCD display with nothing else actually on it, it's because you forgot to plug the interconnect back in. Very easy to forget that step. I've only done it probably 8 times myself, and it scares me every single time. But if you have any questions, comments, put them in the comments. Please subscribe to the channel. If there's any particular model problems you'd like to see, put them in the comments. I see most models of HPs that are out there in the workforce, so anything you can't fix, just put a little comment down there and subscribe, and I'll be happy to help you. One of the other things people almost always forget to do is plugging this plug back into the high voltage board, or as HP calls it, the upper high voltage board. So just make sure you get that plug back in. And whenever you do the DC controller plugs, always press on both sides of them just to make sure they're fully seated. Really stinks when you put the whole thing back together and it throws some random error just because you didn't get the plug pushed all the way down in on both sides. There's a lot of plugs, but guarantee if you triple check them, it'll save you a lot of time in the long run.